You might remember the image. It's in the textbooks, on cereal boxes, coloring books, perhaps dimly echoed in some far corner of your childhood memory. A tall metal man, encased head to toe in glinting steel. He moves with a dramatic clank, like a walking bell tower. Every step is heavy, slow, thunderous. He is the knight. Heavy, noble, encumbered with honor and apparently 100 pounds of armor. But tonight, softly and slowly, we'll set that clanking figure down, gently. Carefully, piece by piece. Because, you see, the knight's armor wasn't really all that heavy. Not as heavy as we were told in school. Not so heavy he needed to be hoisted onto a horse with ropes and pulleys, as some museum placards might imply. The truth is less theatrical and more mundane, more human, more like a thick coat on a windy day. Cumbersome, sure, but not unbearable. Let's begin not in battle, but in the dressing room. Not with swords raised, but with linen. Always linen first, a soft underlayer. Maybe a simple tunic, sometimes split at the sides to allow for a bit more mobility. Imagine it, rough woven, smelling faintly of lye soap and the faint must of last week's wear. Under that, perhaps a pair of hose tied at the hips. This was the beginning of armor, not iron, not steel, just cloth. Cloth and then padding. The gambeson came next, quilted, stuffed with wool or horsehair or scraps of cloth. It was thick, stiff, warm. Not the sort of thing you'd want to nap in, unless you had no other choice. But it protected, and it was the true armor beneath the armor. Only then, with that warm, padded foundation in place, would come the mail. Not chainmail, by the way. That word's a modern invention. They simply called it mail. A mesh of small rings, each one carefully riveted shut by hand. Thousands of them. Sometimes tens of thousands. Linked one by apprentices in the dim flicker of torchlight with sore fingers and sleepy eyes. Wearing mail was like wearing a shimmering iron sweater. It draped over the body. It shifted with every movement. It was heavy. Yes, perhaps 20 to 30 pounds of weight distributed across the shoulders. But it wasn't rigid, and it didn't freeze a man in place. You could walk in it. You could climb stairs in it. You could swing a sword, raise your arms, even slowly dance in it if you were so inclined. In fact, tests with replica mail show that trained men could run, jump, and mount horses quite competently while wearing it. Of course, you might sweat more than usual. The armor didn't breathe. But the image of a knight trapped like a turtle in a tin shell, that's a bit of a stretch. A clumsy exaggeration. Plate came later, and even then, it was built to move. Articulated joints, leather straps, clever engineering. Think of it like a medieval exosuit, designed not to imprison a man, but to preserve him. It rarely covered every inch. Under the armpits, behind the knees, those soft places often remained protected only by mail or padding. The full head-to-toe suit of gleaming steel, the one you see standing silent in museums, was a specific style, popular in the late 15th century and mostly ceremonial. Expensive, specialized, and importantly, rare. Most knights never wore it. Many couldn't afford to, and here we might pause for a moment to feel the clink and sway of mail as a man walks down a corridor of cold stone. The sound isn't loud, it's soft, like coins shifting in a purse. The weight sways gently with each step. You'd get used to it. Armor was heavy, yes, but manageable. A trained knight, well-fed, physically active, conditioned since boyhood, could move with grace. He might even forget he was wearing it, until he tried to sit. And even then, most armor came apart in segments. Breastplate, pauldrons, greaves, gauntlets, not welded shut, not a solid suit like a sardine tin, just a lot of buckles, a lot of laces, a lot of waiting. Which leads us to an important quiet truth. Knights weren't always wearing their armor. In fact, they mostly weren't. You wouldn't wear a wool coat to bed, nor would you spend a summer afternoon wrapped in thick padding and steel unless absolutely necessary. That's something we'll slowly explore next time. But for now, rest easy. The image of the endlessly clanking knight, frozen in metal, it's mostly fantasy. He could walk. He could move. He could even scratch his nose if he needed to. And as you drift towards sleep, let the picture fade of a stiff, silver figure forever marching into battle. Replace it with something softer. A man adjusting the buckle of his mail shirt. A squire folding cloth in the firelight. The muted clatter of armor being laid out at dusk. Warm metal, cooling slowly by a canvas tent. And just outside the tent, the sound of a horse shifting in the grass, and the slow exhale of another quiet medieval evening. There's a peculiar little image tucked away in the collective imagination. The knight, seated at a great oak table, still fully armored, perhaps a goblet in one hand and a turkey leg in the other. He clinks and clangs with every motion, his breastplate gleaming in the firelight as he leans forward for another bite. It is a strangely persistent picture. The idea that a knight wore his armor constantly, even casually, as though it were simply a part of daily attire, like a tunic, or a hat, or a particularly inconvenient second skin. But in the quiet corners of medieval life, the truth is far less theatrical. Armor, for all its utility and symbolism, was not something one simply lounged around in. It was not for mealtime, or idle walks through the garden. It was, like many things in life, best taken off as soon as one reasonably could. You must first understand that armor was in many ways a burden of purpose, not something donned out of vanity or tradition, but something carefully, even solemnly prepared for, and worn only when necessary. It was protection, yes, but also labor. To wear it was to sweat, to breathe shallowly, to shift one's weight more carefully with each step. Not impossible, of course, not torturous, but not comfortable either. It was warm, especially with the layers beneath, the thick gambeson, the long sleeves of mail, the linen undershirt already dampened with the effort of lifting arms above one's head. And beyond the heat, there was the simple matter of time. Putting on armor took time, sometimes half an hour, sometimes more, depending on the complexity and who was helping. No one did it alone, not really. A knight had a squire, or two, and often a few other helping hands if time allowed. Buckles had to be secured, laces tightened, greaves strapped, mail adjusted, gauntlets fitted finger by finger. It was not the kind of thing you put on just to impress a few guests over stew and small beer. No one dressed in full armor for soup. The idea is rather like imagining a firefighter eating dinner in his turnout gear, or a scuba diver wandering the kitchen in flippers. It's a fine storybook vision, but it doesn't quite hold up under the flickering light of historical reality. So where then was the armor kept when not in use? The answer varies, as most things in history do, depending on the century, the wealth of the knight, and the size of the household. But typically, armor was stored with care, laid on stands or hooks, sometimes nestled into wooden chests lined with cloth. Not tossed in a pile, not forgotten in a dusty corner, but maintained, oiled, occasionally mended. Metal rusts, straps wear out, rivets loosen, and so armor required upkeep. Small, meticulous rituals performed by squires or household servants. A bit of tallow here, some leather polish there. A new strap sewn with strong thread before the old one frayed completely. These were quiet tasks, done by firelight, often in silence, the only sound a soft brushing of cloth against steel. To dress a knight for battle, or even just for training, was not a swift or solitary thing. It was a process. First the linen, then the gambeson, tied tight at the chest. Then the chausse, mail leggings, heavy and awkward, fitted with effort. Then the hauberk, that long mail shirt draped over the head with a grunt and adjusted until it sat just right. Next came the pieces of plate, the breastplate, the backplate, the pauldrons for the shoulders, the couters for the elbows, the greaves and sabatons for the shins and feet. The helmet was last, and even that came in varieties. Some closed entirely, with slits for vision and breath. Others opened on hinges, allowing for a glimpse of the face within, flushed with heat perhaps, or streaked with dust. And when it was time to remove it all, the process reversed, slowly, with sighs of relief and the occasional quiet complaint. The knight might sit on a wooden bench, arms loose at his sides, as his squire unlaced the vambraces from his wrists. One by one, the pieces came away, metal cooling in the open air, padding damp with sweat, mail sagging into a heap. The knight might flex his fingers with gratitude, scratch his beard, roll his shoulders. He might mutter something about the weight, though he'd borne it all without much fuss. And then perhaps, with the last buckle undone and the last ring of mail set aside, he'd stand, lighter now, freer, and head off toward the bathhouse or the kitchens, or to simply sit alone under the trees. Because knights were people, not statues, not iron golems. They took off their armor when it was not needed, just like anyone else would shed a coat on a warm day. In the camp, in the hall, in the stillness of an evening fire, they preferred to breathe easily, to wear soft tunics and rough hose, to rest their arms without the tug of plate, to eat with bare fingers and clean linen napkins rather than clumsy steel gloves. And when armor was worn, it meant something. It meant readiness or caution or ceremony. It meant the moment had come to prepare, to be cautious, to act. And when the moment passed, the armor came off again. It's rather comforting in a way to think that even knights longed for a moment to sit comfortably, that even in a world of battles and banners, they too preferred soft breezes on their skin, the relief of unbuckling a strap, the cool touch of linen after a long hot day. They weren't bound to their armor, they stepped in and out of it, just as we might step into and out of the roles we play. No one wears the mask all the time. No one wears the armor forever, so the next time you picture a knight at supper, try not to see a metal statue at the table. Picture instead a man in a loose tunic, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hands stained with oil or dust or meat grease. His armor is nearby, perhaps, resting quietly in the corner of the room. A breastplate balanced carefully on a chair. A helmet set down like a polished bowl. His squire asleep against the wall, boots off, dreaming of tournaments and horses, and something warm to eat. And somewhere beyond that scene, perhaps outside, under the slow sweep of stars, a distant horse shifts in the stable. A torch flickers. A breath of wind curls past a wooden shutter. Life goes on, slowly, gently, without clang or clatter. We've come now to one of the most enduring shapes in our shared imagination, the knight's sword. Slim, silver, straight, with a cross-shaped hilt and perhaps a jewel in the pommel. It appears in tapestries, in paintings, in storybooks and films. In school plays, a child's wooden replica becomes Excalibur, or something close enough. We grew up thinking every knight had one, wore it at the hip, swung it on battlefields, polished it by moonlight, lived and died by it. The sword is in many ways the very symbol of knighthood, a shining rod of justice, always close at hand. But let's take that image and once again soften it a little. Let's hold it in our hands a while and feel what it really was. Not a constant companion, not always sharp, and not nearly as common as we've been led to believe. You see, swords, real swords, good swords, were expensive. Not in a casual way, not in the way of a fine coat or a new horse. They were luxury items, status symbols. To own one was to say something not just about your wealth, but your place in the world. A sword was forged from high-quality iron or steel, folded and tempered with painstaking care. The blade might take weeks to shape properly, longer still to sharpen, and more still to mount. The handle fitted with wood or bone or horn, wrapped in wire, in leather, sometimes engraved. And when it was done, it had to be balanced. Not just heavy on one end or dull on the other, but balanced with subtlety, the way a tightrope walker finds stillness at the center of a swaying rope. This craftsmanship came at a price. A sword properly made could cost as much as a small farm. Because of that, not every soldier carried one. In fact, most didn't. Knights, yes, sometimes, and nobles when they could afford it. But the average fighting man on the medieval field was far more likely to carry something humbler. A spear, a poleaxe, a short-handled hammer, or a sharpened farming tool. These were cheaper, easier to replace, and often more useful in the brutal press of battle. A spear could be made with a wooden shaft and a forged iron tip, much less expensive than a sword, and better suited to fighting in a line. You could thrust from behind the front row, keep your enemy at bay. You didn't need years of training. You needed muscle, coordination, and a bit of nerve. And perhaps that's why so many battles were decided not by elegant duels, but by shoving. Long lines of men pushing forward, slowly in the mud, the sharp ends of spears quivering just inches apart. Even knights themselves didn't always reach first for the sword. It was a sidearm, a backup. The sort of thing you might draw when your primary weapon was lost or broken or stuck in a shield. In real fighting, a sword wasn't always practical. It was too short for cavalry, too delicate for smashing armor. Instead, you might carry a mace, blunt and brutal, designed to dent rather than slice. Or a warhammer, small and dense, capable of delivering a sudden, shattering blow. There were poleaxes, too. Long-handled weapons with an axe blade on one side and a hammer or spike on the other. These could hook an enemy's shield, pull him off balance, or split the side of his helmet like an egg if the angle was just right. Not elegant, not romantic, but very effective. Still, the sword remained a symbol, even if it wasn't always the most used weapon. It was worn at ceremonies, at tournaments, sometimes at court. It might be passed down from father to son, named, treasured, blessed by a priest. And it had a kind of quiet gravity to it, a suggestion of class, of history, of stories told in low voices around the fire. But it needed care too, constant care. The blade had to be cleaned, kept dry, oiled to prevent rust. The edge had to be maintained, resharpened slowly on stone. Leather sheaths could rot, metal scabbards could dent. And so a knight who owned a sword didn't just carry it, he maintained it, or paid someone to. If you could follow a knight through his days, through the long stretches between battles, you'd find the sword often resting. Hanging from a hook on a wall, laid on a chest at the foot of the bed, wrapped in cloth to protect it from the damp. It didn't clang at every step. It wasn't waved around like a banner. It was heavy, after all. Maybe 3 pounds, but long, unwieldy. The balance helped. Yes, but it wasn't meant to be a plaything. You carried it with deliberation. You drew it with care, and in many cases, you didn't draw it at all. In peaceful times, it might be worn for show. At a tournament, a knight might carry it onto the field, not for the joust, which used blunted lances, but for the melee. Yet even then, it might be dulled, its point rounded, its edge blunted. You weren't meant to kill your opponent. You were meant to perform, to show strength, agility, grace. Real fighting, when it came, was something else entirely. Chaotic, dirty, exhausting. And often it was over before the sword came out of its scabbard. And so the sword, while famous, while adored, was never the everyday object we imagine. It was rare. It was costly, and it was in its way delicate, more an emblem than a tool, more often cleaned than used. It lived in stories, in songs, in seals and insignia. But on the field, in the mud, with rain falling sideways and the press of men closing in, a knight might very well leave it on his belt and fight with whatever was at hand, a poleaxe, a spear, a dagger in the ribs. So as you settle now into sleep, let the image of the ever-ready, sword-swinging knight melt gently away. Picture instead a quiet room, perhaps a castle chamber or the corner of a manor hall. A sword rests on a wooden bench, gleaming dully in the firelight. Beside it, a sharpening stone, a small cloth, still damp with oil. The knight is elsewhere, perhaps asleep already, or studying a map by candlelight. The sword waits, not eager, not restless, just still. It is not a constant presence. It is not a daily instrument. It is a thing of ceremony, of significance, touched only when needed and otherwise left alone. And beyond that quiet room, the world continues to breathe. Slowly, softly. Horses stamp in the stables, wind lifts the edge of a woolen curtain, a candle gutters, then steadies. And somewhere in the darkness, a squire dreams of holding a sword of his own, not to use, but simply to have, because for many, that was enough. Close your eyes now just a little, and let your mind drift back to the image you've carried since childhood. A knight on the battlefield, sword in hand, his movements swift and decisive. Perhaps he spins, lunges, parries, slicing through the air with precision. The fight is clean, almost choreographed, like a graceful duel on a castle wall or a dramatic moment on a fog-draped field. One knight, one enemy, locked in noble combat. Sparks fly from clashing blades and valor triumphs before sunset. It's a comforting image, symmetrical, tidy, even a little heroic. But like many comforting things, it doesn't quite match the texture of reality. When we look more closely, when we lift the veil of legend, the real knight's fight was not elegant. It was not precise. It was most of the time crowded, clumsy, wet with sweat and rain and worse. It was the sound of dull metal striking wood, the groan of bodies leaning into one another, the grunt of a man trying to keep his footing in churned-up mud. Real fighting, as it turns out, was mostly about pressure, the weight of your opponent, the weight of your own armor, the weight of the moment. On the battlefield, knights didn't duel so much as collide. Imagine it. Two groups of armored men advancing on foot or horseback, pushing forward with shields, polearms, whatever they had to hand. There were no clean one-on-one showdowns. There were clusters, noisy, crowded scrums of bodies moving in uncertain rhythms. A shove, a fall, a boot finding mud or slipping on blood. You didn't have room to swing a sword theatrically. You jabbed, you shoved, you waited for an opening, and tried to survive the opening after that. There were no cinematic flourishes, just exhaustion, dull pain, and the hope of holding your ground. And in the middle of this mess, not above it, not apart from it, were the knights. For all their training and titles, they too stumbled. They sweated under their helmets. They got knocked down. They got winded. Sometimes they were trampled. Their armor helped. It could turn a blade, absorb a blow, but it didn't make them invincible. Nor did it make them graceful. Armor creaked. It restricted movement, just enough to slow a turn or delay a sidestep. And in a melee, seconds were precious. You might not be pierced by a blade, but you could be crushed by the weight of the man behind you. You could suffocate under your own visor if you didn't keep moving. You could die in silence, unseen, while others pushed forward toward some invisible banner fluttering in the smoke. If you were on horseback, you had the advantage of height, but not always of balance. Horses could be panicked by noise, injured by pikes, brought down in the crush. A knight unhorsed might fall awkwardly, unable to rise quickly, struggling with the weight of his gear. And once on the ground, he was just another man, mud-covered, vulnerable, breathing hard through narrow slits. The romantic vision of a knight charging on a noble steed only lasted as long as the steed's footing. Once lost, the knight became part of the slow, sodden scramble like everyone else. That's not to say knights didn't train. They did, endlessly in fact. From youth, they practiced with wooden swords, padded weapons, blunted lances. They trained in the art of falling safely, of rolling, of recovering quickly. They worked with sparring partners under the eye of instructors who watched for posture, grip, and discipline. But real fighting was never like the training yard. It was louder, more chaotic, unscripted, and even the most seasoned warrior could be unseated by bad luck or a stray blow to the knee. The battlefields were rarely flat. Often they were littered with debris, broken weapons, discarded shields, even the bodies of the fallen. To fight in such terrain was to stumble, to misjudge your footing, to twist an ankle just before your opponent lunged. Victory was as much about endurance as skill, sometimes more. And then there was jousting, that stylized echo of warfare that we often confuse for its reality. In the joust, two armored men faced each other across a narrow field, lances at the ready, horses bridled and eager. They charged, timed to the trumpet's call, and aimed to strike the other's shield or chest with the tip of the lance, usually blunted, designed to break on impact. It was violent, yes, but structured. The point was not to kill, but to display courage, precision, and showmanship. It was sport, ritual. It had rules, spectators, applause, and though injuries were common, broken bones, concussions, sometimes worse, it was a far cry from the confusion of war. Jousting was a controlled thunderclap. War was a long, groaning storm. Even in the training yard, the weapons were dull. The strikes were restrained. There were lessons in footwork, in timing, in grappling, how to disarm, how to trip, how to find a weak point in the armor. Knights might learn to fight with sword and shield, yes, but also with mace and dagger, with axe and polearm. The diversity of weapons reflects the unpredictability of the battlefield. You used what worked, what you could reach, what didn't break. A knight might begin a battle with a lance, lose it in the charge, draw a sword for a while, then drop it to wrestle his opponent to the ground. In the thick of it, the best weapon was often the one you still had in your hand. And always, always, there was noise. The roar of voices. Commands shouted, prayers muttered, cries of pain. The clatter of hooves on stone, the shriek of arrows overhead, the grinding sound of metal against wood. Not the ringing, musical clangs you hear in films, but dull impacts, brief and heavy, like mallets on shields, like someone pounding on a wet door. The sound of real battle wasn't thrilling. It was muffled, grim, and somehow far away. Even as it happened around you, it felt distant. Adrenaline blurred the edges. Time moved strangely. You might see the sun breaking through clouds in the middle of a sword swing, or notice the pattern on your opponent's tunic as he shoved you backwards into the mud. You remember strange things, not the final blow, but the smell of the grass, the weight of your shield, the coldness of your hands. So the next time you imagine a knight fighting, don't picture a dance. Picture a slow-moving wave of men, pushing against each other, shoulder to shoulder. Picture hands gripping polearms slick with sweat. Picture someone stumbling, crawling, getting to his knees, rising again, too stubborn to quit. Picture not the sound of a violin string being cut, but of boots squelching through churned-up soil. That was real combat. Not noble, not beautiful, but human, messy, confusing, heavy. And now, as your thoughts begin to soften and drift, let the clamor of that imagined battle fade into the distance. Let the muddy field fall silent. Let the armored men become still, not fallen, just resting. The fog rolls in, the torches flicker low. Somewhere in the grass, a discarded helm fills slowly with rainwater, and nearby a knight lies back, staring up through the slit in his visor at the pale gray sky. Breathing. Just breathing. If you close your eyes and let the word castle settle in your mind for a moment, you might see something from a storybook. A tall, proud tower perched atop a green hill, perhaps, with fluttering banners and golden torches glowing in every window. Maybe there's music drifting faintly from a banquet hall. The stone is clean, the air is warm, and someone in a velvet cloak walks gracefully beneath the vaulted ceilings. Everything feels regal, soft, inviting, rich with comfort and power. And yet the truth, as is often the case in history, is more humble, more practical, and much colder. Because real castles, the ones lived in by real knights, their families, their servants, their horses, and all the weary clutter of medieval life, were not warm. They were not soft. They were not built for comfort at all, but for defense, survival, and shelter against uncertainty. Their stone walls were thick, yes, but those walls did not insulate. In summer, the air within might feel cool at first, a small relief from the heat. But in winter, the cold crept in like a quiet guest and refused to leave. The chill would cling to the stone, sink into your bones, and settle there long after the fires had died down to coals. You could warm your hands by the hearth, yes, but as soon as you stepped away to fetch a pail of water or close the shutter, the cold would return, brushing your skin like a damp sheet. The floors were often bare. sometimes covered with rushes or woven mats, though these became dusty or damp or infested with the little things no one speaks about in songs. Fleas, bits of food, hair from the dog. The walls, unless draped with tapestries, were simply gray stone, uneven and pitted with age. And though the windows sometimes glimmered with colored glass in the wealthiest keeps, more often they were narrow slits, designed not for beauty but for archers. They let in light, yes, and wind, sometimes snow, sometimes the cry of an owl just before dawn. Glass was costly, curtains were rare. And so the wind wandered through these places as it pleased, threading through hallways and under doors, lifting the edges of cloaks, sending the smoke of a torch twisting against the ceiling. There was warmth to be found, of course, but it was fleeting and localized. Fires burned in great halls, where the family might eat beneath a timbered roof, while servants moved quietly behind them. The hearth was large, the flames bright, but the heat rarely reached beyond a few paces. You might sit close and feel your cheeks flush, then step back and feel the chill return, biting through your sleeves. Bedrooms, or solars, as they were sometimes called, had smaller hearths, often burning low through the night, attended by someone sleepy-eyed with a bundle of wood. The beds themselves were often raised on wooden frames, covered in straw mattresses, with woolen blankets and sometimes fur throws. But even tucked in under layers of cloth, you might wake in the night to find your breath visible in the air. And so people slept close, sometimes side by side, layered in night clothes, heads wrapped, hands tucked beneath pillows not for comfort, but to keep them warm. And the light, well, it was soft and limited. Torches lined the halls in the evening, flickering with an orange, uncertain glow. They hissed slightly as they burned and left soot in the air. Candles were used too, though they were a luxury, made of tallow or beeswax, casting a small, warm circle of light and little more. After sundown, the castle grew dim quickly. Shadows gathered in corners and doors were barred early. People spoke softly. Night was not feared, perhaps, but it was respected. There were no switches to flip, no steady glow to chase away the dark. Instead, people leaned into the night, rose with the sun, slept with the stars, and lit only what was needed. It might surprise you to know, too, that most knights didn't actually live in castles. Castles were expensive and rare, and often belonged to powerful lords or barons who held large stretches of land. Many knights lived in manor houses, simpler structures, still made of wood or stone but humbler in design. Fewer towers, fewer battlements, still drafty, still cold, still practical. They were built for work, for storage, for the steady rhythms of rural life. And even in the larger keeps, the day-to-day was filled with chores, administration, the slow business of keeping things running, managing fields, collecting rents, hosting guests, sorting disputes between villagers. It wasn't all feasts and falconry. It was ledgers and keys and the endless search for dry firewood. Still, there was a kind of beauty in it. Not the bright, polished kind we imagine in films, but the subtle beauty of necessity, of things built to last. Stone steps worn smooth by years of boots, wooden beams darkened by torch smoke and time. Iron hinges, rusted slightly but still strong. A castle's comfort lay not in softness but in its endurance, in the knowledge that it would still be standing after the storm had passed, that its walls would still be there in the morning, gray and steady against the sky. And so as you drift now, as your breathing slows and your thoughts begin to cloud like the cold air beneath a high vaulted ceiling, let go of the castle of fairy tales. Picture instead the real thing, a narrow bed tucked beneath a woolen blanket, a single candle flickering on a rough wooden table, casting shadows up a stone wall, a pair of boots left by the fire, steaming gently, a window slit open to the wind, the stars barely visible through low clouds. Somewhere down the corridor, a servant whispers to another. A log shifts in the hearth. The castle sighs. It is not grand, but it is standing, and that for the people who lived inside it, was comfort enough. There are parts of the past we tend to skip over, not out of malice, but out of politeness. We imagine the castles and the kings, the banners and the feasts, and we let our thoughts drift right past the quieter, messier parts of medieval life. We don't ask what happened to the food after the feast, or where someone went in the middle of the night if they needed to relieve themselves. We forget that even knights had to wash their hands, their hair, their underclothes. Somehow, we imagine a world built of iron and honor, and rarely pause to wonder what it smelled like. But if you stood for a moment at the threshold of a real medieval castle, not the painted kind, but the lived-in kind, you might notice it before you even stepped inside. A scent in the air, a mingling of wood smoke, sweat, wool, damp stone, animals, ash, tallow, old wood, and something else, a sort of earthiness that doesn't quite fade, no matter how clean the rushes are or how recently the rushlight was changed. Not foul, not unbearable, but lived in, heavy with time, with use, with the unglamorous reality of people simply existing together in close quarters, with little privacy, little plumbing, and plenty of straw. Let's begin with the floors, because that's where much of medieval life took place. There were no carpets, not in the way we imagine them. A noble might have a woven rug or two, imported, treasured, used sparingly. But for most, the floors were strewn with rushes, bundles of reeds or straw laid down to soften footfalls and absorb spills. They were replaced sometimes and swept occasionally, but not daily. Beneath the rushes, things collected, dropped bits of bread, spilled wine, dog hair, the occasional flea or crumb or piece of ash. It wasn't a mess, not in the way we might think, but a kind of layered domestic sediment, signs of use, not neglect. Servants swept when they could. The air was aired out when the weather allowed. But a castle was not a sterile place. It was a working one. And then, the privy. Not a word we hear much anymore, though it simply means a private place, in this case a small room, often tucked away in the outer wall, just above a vertical shaft. A stone bench, a narrow seat, and below it, a drop into open air or a cesspit, or sometimes a moat. These rooms were narrow, cold, sometimes drafty. You wouldn't linger. You'd go with a candle or in daylight. You might carry moss or a bit of cloth, or if you were fortunate, scraps of linen to clean yourself with. Water was scarce and mostly brought by hand. There was no toilet paper, no plumbing, no flush. The smell was constant, especially in summer. Servants sometimes tossed herbs onto the floors to cover it, or hung sweet-smelling bundles near the doors. But these were gestures. It was never entirely fresh. For those living lower in the social structure, the kitchen boys, the maids, the grooms, there might be no privy at all. Chamber pots were used instead, simple ceramic bowls kept under the bed or by the hearth, emptied each morning by someone less fortunate still. You might wake before dawn, dress quietly, and walk a full 50 paces across a drafty hallway just to find a place to go. And on bitter nights, when the air bit at your feet and the wind curled through the shutters, you might not go at all. You'd wait until morning, or use the pot or step just outside and hope no one saw. Modesty, like hygiene, took on a different shape when the world was colder, darker, and more physical than ours. Bathing did happen, just not with the frequency or expectations of today. A noble might bathe once a week or for special occasions. Wooden tubs were brought into rooms and filled by hand with warm water from the hearth. It took time, it took labor, and the water cooled quickly. People washed their faces, their hands, their feet more regularly. Small wash basins with linen cloths were common, but full-body immersion was rare. Not unknown, not unvalued, just impractical. Soap existed, but it was made from lye and fat, harsh by our standards. It got the job done, but it stung if you weren't careful, and it didn't smell like lavender. More often, people relied on changing into clean linen, brushing out their hair, and keeping themselves presentable through simpler means. Clothing helped. Undergarments, especially linen shifts and shirts, were worn close to the body and washed frequently. Outer layers, made of wool or leather, were brushed or aired, but not laundered often. Smell was simply part of life. People noticed it, yes, and took steps to lessen it, but they did not expect the world to be scentless. A knight might ride for days without bathing and think nothing of it. A noblewoman might wear herbs in her bodice or comb rosewater into her hair. A servant might scrub their hands with ashes after working with meat. It was a world of small rituals, quiet efforts, and lowered expectations, not because people were ignorant, but because they were realistic. Water had to be drawn. Fire had to be lit. Cleanliness took time, and time was not always a luxury. And so, when we picture the medieval world, we must remember the layers, not just of clothing or armor, but of experience. The smells that lingered in the corners of halls, the cold that settled into stone at night, the straw underfoot that cushioned every step but never stayed truly clean. The long walks to the garderobe, the clink of a chamber pot being carried through the hall, the scent of herbs laid out beneath the table to keep the air a little sweeter. These things do not appear in paintings. They do not echo through the songs of minstrels, but they were part of daily life, as constant and familiar as the tolling of a bell or the crackle of a low fire. As you drift now, slowly, gently, let yourself walk down a narrow stone hallway. The walls are damp, the torchlight flickers, catching on patches of moss. You're wrapped in a woolen cloak. You feel the chill beneath your bare feet. Somewhere down below, someone is stoking a fire. A soft hiss of rain comes through the arrow slits. The castle breathes in its slow, unhurried way. You pass a bundle of herbs hung near the doorway, tied with string, lavender, maybe mint. Maybe not strong enough to mask the truth of the place, but they're all the same. A little gesture of grace in a world that was never sterile, but always sincere. In the tales we're told, the knight is almost always the hero. He rides into view with his standard high, his sword clean, his armor polished to a mirror's shine. He speaks in clear words, often about honor. His cause is righteous, his manner dignified. He saves the helpless, defends the innocent, and bows before kings without pride or ambition. We're taught to see him as the best kind of man, upright, brave, pure of heart. The knight is the kind of figure one might pin to the inside of a childhood imagination, a shining example of what valor ought to look like. But like most figures carved in silver and story, the real knight, the living, breathing one who walked the earth centuries ago, was something else entirely. Still human, of course, still capable of courage, kindness, and loyalty, but also prone to greed, violence, arrogance, and all the quiet, muddy vices that live just beneath the surface of power. Because knighthood, at its core, was not always a reward for virtue. It was a status, earned or bought or inherited, and it came with expectations that were social, not moral. A knight might swear fealty, might pledge service to a lord, might stand guard at a gate or lead men into battle. But those duties did not guarantee nobility of character. Many knights were simply landowners with the means to afford a horse and armor. Some were minor nobles, raised from birth to fight and manage land. Others were mercenaries, soldiers who'd fought long enough, hard enough, or well-connected enough to be dubbed and given the title. There were knights who fought for causes, yes, but there were also knights who fought for coin, who changed sides in wars, who looted towns, who extorted peasants. There were knights who left behind burned villages, knights who collected taxes with threats, knights whose reputations were whispered, not sung. In many regions, especially during times of instability, knights were more feared than admired. To the common people, the farmers and millers and herdsmen, a knight might arrive not as a protector, but as a problem. He might ride in with a small retinue, demanding food and shelter. He might insist on levies, enforce cruel punishments, or claim rights that had long since lost their moral weight. He might be the arm of a distant lord, or the law unto himself. And while chivalric codes were recited and recorded, they were not always lived. A knight was not held to the standards of our modern hero. He was held to the expectations of his class, his time, his patron. And often, that meant serving power before justice. Even in war, the conduct of knights could be far from clean. Capturing enemies for ransom was often more lucrative than killing them, and so battles might become hunting grounds, with knights chasing down lesser foes to claim a prize. Prisoners were sometimes treated well, but not always. The lines between bravery and brutality blurred quickly on the battlefield. Looting was commonplace. Sieges were slow and cruel, and when a castle finally fell, the rules of mercy could be discarded in the dust. Civilians were not always spared. And behind every tale of victory, there are quieter accounts of pillage, destruction, and despair. These are not the stories embroidered on banners, but they are the ones found in old letters, in tax rolls, in complaints filed by frightened villagers. It's not that all knights were wicked, far from it. Many were simply complicated. Just as we are, they had pride, they had families, they had debts, they had ambitions. They might be kind to their squires and cruel to their servants. They might donate to a monastery and then rob a rival manor. They might weep at the loss of a brother in battle, then turn around and enforce a brutal tithe on their lands. They were shaped by the same contradictions we all live with, capable of compassion and capable of cruelty. The armor they wore didn't change that. It only made their choices heavier. And in the halls where they gathered, not on horseback, not in battle, but by candlelight, over maps and wine and letters from lords, power moved more quietly. Alliances were made not with swords, but with marriages and favors and debts repaid. A noble might knight a man not for bravery, but because he needed his support. A title could be granted for gold or for loyalty or for convenience. It wasn't all ceremony and merit. Much of it was negotiation. And in those rooms, the gleam of a knight's sword mattered far less than the names he could invoke, the papers he could sign, the lands he could claim. Valor was nice, but influence was better. And so we begin to see the knight not as a shining hero, but as something more ordinary, and in that ordinariness, more real. He was a man shaped by a system, sometimes uplifted by it, sometimes corrupted. He made decisions based not always on what was good, but on what was expected, what was profitable, what would keep him in the favor of his lord. And perhaps, if we are honest, that makes him more understandable. Less remote. Not a mythic figure, but a person moving through a difficult world, trying, and sometimes failing, to hold on to something like honor in a time that didn't always reward it. So as you lie back now, listening, perhaps somewhere between waking and dreaming, picture a knight not on the battlefield but sitting by firelight, his armor off, his gloves on the table, a half-full cup of wine in his hand. He is not young, he is not smiling. His eyes are tired, his face quiet. He has done things he is proud of, and things he is not. The candle flickers. He glances toward the window where the wind stirs the edge of the tapestry. Outside, the world carries on, horses shifting in the stable, a dog barking once, distantly, and he thinks not of glory, but of land disputes, of debts owed, of a message he must send come morning. He is not a hero, he is a man, and he must rise early. If you close your eyes and imagine a night being made, you might see it unfold in the bright language of fairy tales. A young squire, brave and untested, kneels before his lord on a sunlit day. The great hall is hushed, a sword is laid upon each shoulder. A few solemn words are spoken, of loyalty, of courage, of truth. The boy stands, now a man, and his life is changed forever. He has been chosen, proved worthy, granted a sacred honor. That's the story we hear, again and again. That knighthood was something bestowed upon the deserving, a gift given in recognition of noble character, hard training, and battlefield valor. But like many rituals, the dubbing of a knight was more complicated in practice than it was in legend. And sometimes it had less to do with worth and more to do with wealth. The ceremony, yes, was real. There were oaths, there were sponsors, there was the sword and the solemn touch on the shoulder. But behind the words, there was often a quiet murmur of coin. Knighthood, especially by the high Middle Ages, had become something like a club, one you could join if you had the right connections, the right pedigree, or, failing that, enough silver in your purse. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't even frowned upon in most circles. In fact, for many noble families, knighting a son, or even a nephew or a favored retainer, was part of the natural progression of their social ambitions. A title for a son could help secure a marriage. A second or third son might lack inheritance, but gain prestige. A wealthy merchant might see his fortunes rise enough to nudge his way into the lower rungs of the aristocracy. And what better way than through knighthood? It's important to remember that titles in the medieval world were not fixed points of honor, but fluid, negotiated identities. A man might be called Sir in one town and ignored in another. Genealogy could be rewritten, and often was, by scribes paid to craft family trees that reached back into respectable soil. Documents were copied by hand, often by monks, and the boundaries between fact and flattery were gently blurred. A family might commission a crest, have it carved into a tomb, and thus over time a noble lineage could be quietly invented. This wasn't fraud, not exactly. It was simply part of the social landscape, a game of appearances, tokens, and quiet arrangements behind closed doors. The trappings of knighthood, the spurs, the coat of arms, the seat at the feast, could be bought, in parts or all at once, given the right moment and the right price. Even the church, which in theory upheld ideals of humility and service, occasionally looked the other way. Bishops depended on the donations and protection of local lords, many of whom held knightly status. Monasteries received gifts of land and gold from families hoping to raise their sons in the eyes of both man and God. And so the title passed quietly from hand to hand. Not always with a clashing of swords, but with ink, wax seals, and coin purses drawn beneath cloaks in shaded alcoves. And then there were the tournaments. Grand, expensive affairs meant to showcase skill and valor, yes, but also to signal wealth, influence, and family prestige. A young man might enter a tournament with an impressive steed and a fine set of armor, perhaps newly inherited or discreetly borrowed. His performance mattered, of course, but so too did the shine of his gear, the number of his retainers, and the quality of his banquet table. A lord watching from the sidelines might see more than just a joust. He might see a potential son-in-law, a new vassal, a man who could serve as both sword and symbol. And from that impression, an offer might emerge. Land, a place in court, a knighthood. Sometimes a knight was made not because he had slain dragons or saved kings, but because he looked the part, dined well, and knew when to laugh at the right man's jokes. Of course, this was not the whole story. Some knights earned their titles through long years of service, wounds won in battle, loyalty proven on blood-soaked fields. There were men who rose from humble origins through sheer tenacity, who were knighted by grateful lords in real acts of recognition. But these were exceptions, not the rule. The quieter, more common truth was that knighthood was as much about politics as it was about principle. It was shaped by marriages, inheritances, alliances. It was spoken in the language of favors, favors owed, favors called in. And like so many systems built by people, it favored those who already had a foothold. We often think of medieval society as rigid, fixed in place, lords above, peasants below, with knights somewhere in the middle, guardians of a code. But the truth was more fluid. People moved within the system in subtle ways, through marriage, through clever arrangements, through quiet ambition. A merchant's son might find himself at court. A landless knight might marry well and rise. A second-born noble might trade his inheritance for a position in the royal guard. The machinery of social movement was slow, yes, and limited, but it was not altogether still. And knighthood, with its mix of romance and utility, became a kind of ladder for those with the means to climb. And so, when you picture the quiet ritual of knighthood, the kneeling figure, the solemn words, the lifted sword, let your thoughts drift behind the scene. Past the banners and the torches, into the counting rooms, the halls of parchment and wax. The rooms where marriages were arranged, where land was divided, where debts were tracked. These were the other altars of knighthood. Places where the title was weighed not in glory, but in gold. There is something humbling in that, perhaps. A reminder that even the most sacred symbols can be shaped by the practical needs of the world. As you settle now, deeper into stillness, let yourself imagine a quieter scene. A dim room lit by two narrow windows. A young man sits at a heavy table. He wears a fine tunic, too new for dust. His boots are polished, his hands still unscarred. In front of him, an older man with ink-stained fingers slides a sealed document across the table. The young man takes it, nods, and says nothing. Outside, bells ring. Horses shift in the yard. The ink dries. A new night is made, not on the field, not in a storybook, but here, in the hush of parchment and promise. There's a kind of music in the word chivalry. It lands soft on the tongue, like something silver and smooth, a polished idea carried in the wind of an old story. You might picture it now, a knight on a white horse, eyes steady beneath his helm, pausing at the edge of a sun-dappled forest. There's a lady in a high window, a favor tied to his arm, a promise made. No harm to the innocent, no blow struck in anger, truth upheld, virtue guarded, and always love. Courtly, reverent, untouchable. It's a dream stitched into fairy tales and painted into tapestries. A dream of knights who were not only brave, but gentle, romantic, noble in word and deed. The code of chivalry. We were told it was the law of their hearts. But the truth, whispered like a draft through the cracks in a chapel wall, is that much of this, the roses, the vows, the lofty ideals, was invented by poets, not practiced by warriors. The earliest knights, those of the 10th and 11th centuries, were not the courtly lovers we later imagine. They were warriors first. Cavalry trained to defend feudal claims and enforce their lord's will. Their lives were shaped more by power than poetry. They fought, they collected rents, they subdued rivals. And if there was a code they followed, it was one of fealty and survival, not romance and restraint. The word chivalry originally referred not to moral excellence, but to the skills and duties of horsemen, from the Old French chevalerie, meaning simply horsemanship. Only later did it become tangled with ethics, with conduct, with love. And that change came not from the knights themselves, but from those who sang about them. By the 12th century, in the courts of France and beyond, a new kind of literature began to spread. Tales of knights and ladies, of doomed love and impossible quests. Chrétien de Troyes, a court poet, wrote of Lancelot and the Holy Grail, of Gawain and his aching conscience. Troubadours wandered from court to court, reciting verses about longing and restraint, about glances exchanged beneath castle arches. These stories were not historical accounts, they were fantasies, crafted to entertain and to flatter. They spoke less to how knights behaved, and more to how the noble classes wanted to imagine themselves. Chivalry in these tales was a kind of performance, a mirror held up to ideals that rarely touched the dust and blood of real battlefields. In truth, most knights would have found the demands of courtly love impractical. Many were married for land and alliance, not romance. Their lives were governed by loyalty to their lord and the rhythms of war, not by midnight serenades or abstract vows. And as for treating women with reverence, well, the record is complicated. Noble women were sometimes respected, often confined, occasionally traded like assets in political marriages. Peasant women were seldom seen by the law at all. The chivalric code, such as it existed, applied only to interactions among the elite, and even then it was observed in the breach as often as in the keeping. But the stories endured. They were written down in Latin and French and Middle English, copied by monks, enjoyed by queens, quoted in courts. They gave knights something to aspire to or pretend to. And over time, the fiction began to wrap itself around the facts. A knight might dedicate a poem to a lady he barely knew. He might swear an oath of loyalty not just to his lord, but to a vision of himself as more than a hired sword. And while the reality of his daily life remained shaped by mud and mail and politics, the story of chivalry became a kind of script, one that gave his violence a polish, a dignity. If he followed the code, or claimed to, he wasn't just a man in armor. He was part of something bigger. He was righteous. He was good. The danger, of course, is that stories like these, elegant, dreamy, noble, can smooth the edges of truth. We forget the raids, the coercion, the taxes collected by sword point. We forget that the same man who read a love poem by firelight might have led a siege by dawn, that the knight whose name was sung in verse might also be feared in the villages on his estate. Fiction flatters, it makes history easier to admire, but it also makes it harder to see. Still, there's something beautiful in the fiction. It's tempting to believe that the ideals, even if invented, made some difference, that they offered a shape to virtue, even if that shape was only traced in ink and dream. Stories, after all, have power. Even if chivalry was more myth than rule, more performance than practice, it did invite people to imagine better conduct, to raise their eyes, if only briefly, towards something gentler than conquest. And perhaps, as you drift now towards sleep, there's something comforting in that contradiction. The idea that even in a brutal time, people told soft stories. That even amidst the clang of arms, someone was composing lines about a knight pausing by a fountain, lost in thought. That even as lands were disputed and blood was spilled, a young squire might learn to recite verses about mercy and restraint. Maybe they didn't live by the code, but they dreamed about it. And sometimes, dreaming is where change begins. So picture this, if you like, a quiet evening in a stone chamber. A young knight sits near a narrow window, reading by the flickering light of a rush lamp. His armor is off, his boots are muddy. His brow is furrowed not from battle, but from trying to understand a poem in an unfamiliar dialect. He does not quite believe in the code it describes, but he wants to. And as the wind moves the tapestry behind him, he closes the book and lets the idea settle into the silence. The thing about codes, real codes, not poetic ones, is that they're rarely beautiful. They're not written in rhyme. They're not sung under moonlit windows. They come in lists, in Latin or French, copied slowly by clerks hunched over heavy desks in dusty chancelleries. The ink fades. The rules are repeated with small variations from one document to the next. A proper knight must obey his lord. He must protect the church. He must not steal, not murder, not assault the innocent, unless, of course, such things are ordered or convenient or simply not witnessed. The real code of chivalry, the one scribbled into legal charters and moral treatises between the 12th and 15th centuries, was a practical code. It was not made to inspire songs or stir hearts. It was designed to create structure in a world that tilted often toward chaos. And, as you might expect, it was followed inconsistently, interpreted loosely, and broken quietly. Imagine the candlelit room where such rules might be written, a scribe's fingers stained from ink and wax, a drafty hall where parchment curls at the corners. A knight, or perhaps his steward, stands nearby dictating or correcting. The tone is dry, dutiful. This is not the stuff of legend. Do not rob a church. Do not harm those under your lord's protection. Respond to summons. Pay your feudal dues. There is no mention of rescuing maidens or honoring love. The real rules focus on obedience, hierarchy, land, power, and the keeping of the fragile web that held the feudal world together. They are rules about debt and loyalty, taxation and violence. You were not a knight because you fell in love or gave beautiful speeches. You were a knight because you had obligations, military, financial, and spiritual, to those above you. And those obligations came with certain protections, certain rights, and certain brutal expectations. The church, of course, tried to press its hand onto the knightly conscience. It introduced oaths and sermons, encouraged orders of religious knights, the Templars, the Hospitallers, whose vows blended warfare and piety. Bishops blessed swords before campaigns. Knights were told to be champions of the weak, defenders of the faith, and sometimes they tried. Sometimes they rode with a sense of mission. But more often, the rules bent under pressure. War is untidy. Loyalties shift. A knight might swear fealty to one lord and then switch allegiance if the rewards were better. A knight might protect a village 1 month, then raid the next, depending on who held the rights to the grain stores. It was a world of muddy boots and fraying banners, where the line between justice and extortion was drawn in the dust and easily swept away. In some places, a knight might be required to swear the 10 Commandments of chivalry, a later invention, really, drawn up by clerics and scholars who hoped, perhaps in vain, to tidy up the moral compass of the mounted elite. Be loyal to the king, be generous, be brave, be courteous to women. It sounds nice enough. But such declarations were more hopeful than descriptive, like placing a paper crown on a man who already holds a sword. The gestures were symbolic. The real guidance came from land charters, contracts, and whatever unwritten customs governed a particular manor, a particular battlefield. Every knight lived by a code, yes, but that code was as local, as personal, as the color of his livery or the pitch of his hall's roof. There was no single chivalry, no single doctrine. Only many, scattered fragments of what knights were expected to be if the moment allowed and the cost was not too high. And yet, despite all this, despite the inconsistencies, the quiet abandonments of principle, the idea of the code lingered. It gave shape to memory. Chronicles written a generation after a campaign might describe a knight as just, noble, pious, even if contemporary accounts had suggested otherwise. A man's legacy could be chiseled clean in stone. A squire, watching his master deliver harsh justice or negotiate a marriage alliance, might still grow up believing in something softer. Even if chivalry wasn't lived, it was spoken. Even if it was ignored, it was still taught. And so it endured, in the half-light between aspiration and truth. There's something gentle in that contradiction, the way people reach, even imperfectly, for ideals that they know are fragile. The way stories echo in spaces that are otherwise filled with dust and iron. If the real code of chivalry was more rulebook than romance, more caution than courage, that does not mean it had no value. It simply means that it was human, born of our need to create order, to sketch morality onto the rough edges of power, to believe in something a little better than what the world usually allows. So now, as the hours deepen and the room around you grows still, you might picture not a battlefield or a court of love, but a candle flickering low in a quiet chapel. A knight kneels, not in victory, not in penance, but simply out of custom. He recites the words expected of him, oaths he's taken before, oaths he may bend tomorrow. But for now, the words settle into the cold stone around him like breath. He speaks them softly. He means them, perhaps, or perhaps not. But still, he says them, because it is expected, because it is tradition, because sometimes saying the right words, even when we struggle to live them, is how we begin to change. We are told, often without question, that medieval peasants lived in filth and ignorance, hunched and toothless, fearful of eclipses and chained to the land like beasts. It's an image repeated in textbooks and cartoons, a muddy man with a straw hat gaping at a knight as though witnessing a god, while pigs squeal in the background. He knows nothing, we're told. He fears everything. He cannot read, cannot plan, cannot hope. But like so many soft lies wrapped in dramatic exaggeration, this one begins to crumble when held up to the quiet details of real life. Because the peasant was not a fool, he was not a cartoon, He was a man, or a woman, shaped by work and rhythm, by tools and time and place. And what he lacked in polished language or gilded armor, he often made up for in deep, practical understanding of the world around him. Start with the land. The land was not just dirt beneath his feet. It was the map of his year, the calendar of his life. He knew its slopes, its moods, its frost lines. He could look at the sky and predict rain with a kind of intuition that comes not from books, but from bone-deep experience. When to plant barley, when to turn the soil, when the sheep might lamb early, when the stream might rise, these were not guesses. They were knowledge, passed down not in ink but in repetition, in shared tasks, in quiet conversations between generations while gathering rushes or stacking peat. The medieval peasant, far from being thoughtless, was often intensely observant. His world demanded it, his survival required it, and though the written word was out of reach for many, parchment was expensive, ink a luxury, and education tightly controlled by clergy, literacy was not the only form of intelligence. Many peasants could read symbols, count out weights and measures, recite oral histories with precision. In some regions, especially as the Middle Ages wore on, village schools appeared. Boys, and sometimes girls, learned enough to read simple prayers, to copy lists, to write their names. Manor accounts were often managed by men of peasant birth who'd learned basic record-keeping. Church services were in Latin, yes, but sermons were given in the local tongue. A clever peasant might know the saints' days, the parables, the legal customs of his manor, and the best place to catch trout when the river ran slow. Their homes, though simple, were not the squalid hovels we often imagine. They were smoky, yes, and dark, that much is true. A central hearth, a thatched roof, earth floors or wooden planks packed with clay. But there was order. Tools were stored carefully. Herbs were dried and hung near the rafters. Rushes were laid on the floor and swept or changed with some regularity. A family might own a few pewter spoons, a spindle, a chest, a spinning wheel. Chickens wandered in and out. A pig might root in the yard. It was not glamorous, but neither was it disgusting. People washed when they could. They bathed communally in streams or barrels. They combed their hair with wooden combs. They mended their clothes. They cleaned their teeth with ash or twigs or cloth. The idea that peasants were perpetually filthy is more a reflection of modern prejudice than medieval truth. And then there is the matter of value, of how essential the peasant was to the entire machinery of feudal life. Knights might ride out in gleaming armor, but they did so on horses bred, raised, and trained by the labor of commoners. They ate bread milled from grain sown and harvested by villagers, drank ale brewed in cottages, or linen woven by calloused hands. The peasant knew how to care for sheep, how to judge the health of a cow, how to split firewood to last the winter, how to tell the difference between good mushrooms and deadly ones. He knew how to make rope from hemp, how to trap rabbits without leaving tracks, how to patch a thatch roof after a storm. These were not lesser skills. They were vital. Without them, the knight starves, the lord freezes, the manor fails. And still, too often, we dismiss these people as simple, as if knowing how to survive in a brutal and narrow world is somehow less impressive than memorizing the names of dead kings. It is true, of course, that life was hard. Most peasants worked long hours and died young. They suffered under taxes and tithes, were subject to famine and plague. But in that suffering, they also forged communities, tight, resilient, and sometimes surprisingly well organized. Village councils settled disputes. Festivals marked the seasons. Songs were sung around fires, and stories passed from one family to the next. Humor lived there too, and kindness, and a quiet sort of dignity that doesn't fit neatly into textbooks. They weren't fools. They weren't brutes. They were human, just like the rest of us, with dreams scaled to the world they knew. So now, as night softens the world around you, try to picture the peasant not as a caricature in rags, but as a real figure moving across the fields in low morning fog. His boots are damp, his breath shows in the cold air, a worn cap is pulled over his ears. He walks the edge of a furrow with one hand trailing through the soil. There's a rhythm to his steps, a steadiness. He's counting days, remembering seasons, listening to the birds. He knows, without needing to be told, that spring will come early this year. The signs are all around him, if you know how to see them. From the far end of a muddy village path, a knight might look impressive enough. A shape on horseback, draped in color and movement, like a standard come to life. The horse taller than any mule the villagers had seen. The man upright, proud, polished, gleaming just a little in the sun. The children might pause in their games, mouths open, wondering. The old women might cross themselves, out of habit more than belief. But once that horse clattered closer, once its hooves disturbed the puddles, and the knight's face came into view, drawn, stern, surrounded by iron or shadowed beneath a helm, the awe often shifted to something else. Something smaller, warier, and far more grounded. Because from the peasant's view, the knight was not a legend. He was a tax collector's enforcer, a feudal authority, a war-tired noble's youngest son with something to prove. He was power, yes, but not always justice, not always good. It's important to remember that the myth of the noble knight, the protector of the weak, the defender of honor, rarely came from the mouths of the peasants themselves. That image was written by poets, priests, and courtly lovers, by those who stood at a comfortable distance from the dust and rural life. To the villager, the knight was loud. He arrived unannounced, with a retinue or not, expecting food, stabling, deference. He brought demands on behalf of a distant lord. He might inspect the harvest, remind the reeve of unpaid obligations, take an ox in lieu of coin. He might laugh or not speak at all. Some were kind, of course, some offered words of thanks or help, but many were indifferent. Not cruel exactly, just entitled. Their authority was so complete, so assumed, that they didn't need to earn fear or admiration. They simply existed above the people they passed. And there were darker moments. A knight who'd been fighting abroad, in France, in Scotland, in some border skirmish or private quarrel, might return restless, short-tempered, and in need of coin. A village unlucky enough to lie along a campaign route might be ordered to house soldiers, to provide grain, to watch helplessly as fences were trampled and wells fouled. Livestock disappeared. Firewood was taken. Bread was eaten before it cooled. When knights fought each other, it was the peasant fields that became battlegrounds. And after, it was the peasants who picked through the broken carts, buried the bodies, and lived with the silence of scorched earth. To the stories, these were backdrops. To the people, they were memories. Not grand, not glorious. Just hard. Still, there was a strange familiarity in it all. The knight was part of the landscape, part of the structure, like the manor house or the tithe barn or the church bell. The villagers knew who he was. They watched his squires grow tall. They nodded when his steward passed through. Sometimes, if the harvest was good, the knight might host a feast. A few villagers might be invited to help, to stand along the walls and serve food. They saw his table, his tapestries, the way he carved his meat. They listened to his guests speak French or Latin, and quietly noted which ones drank too much wine. And then they returned to their cottages, where the fire smoked low and the children slept, and they told stories of what they'd seen. Not with awe, but with the dry wit of people who understand the shape of power and are not so easily charmed by it. There is a quiet kind of intelligence in that, a grounded wisdom that rarely makes it into the history books. The villagers knew the knights were necessary in a way. They kept order, they held back bandits, they gave the manor its muscle, but the people also knew that knights could be dangerous, careless, distant. Not devils, not heroes, just men with better boots and heavier swords, and so they worked around them, avoided their notice when possible, bribed the steward, flattered the wife, helped the cook. Power always has soft edges, places where it can be influenced. The villagers understood that. They smiled when they needed to. They nodded, they bowed, they told the knight what he wanted to hear, and then, when he left, they said what they really thought by the hearth. The stories of knights were sung in courts and carved into stone, but the stories the peasants told were different. They were jokes, mostly, or warnings, or tiny rebellions wrapped in riddles. They were whispered while mending a fence or gathering herbs. Sir Geoffrey couldn't find his horse if it whinnied in his ear. Sir Hugh's sword is sharp, but not half as sharp as his wife's tongue. These were not fairy tales. These were survival strategies. A village that could laugh at its knight quietly, safely, could survive him, could outlast him, could watch him grow old, grow fat, grow forgotten, and then when he died, they might go to his funeral, bow their heads, say the prayers, and then go home and eat stew and get on with life. So tonight, as you rest, let the image of the knight shift a little, not vanish, just soften. Let him ride not through glory but through mud, past hedgerows and leaning cottages, his visor up, his expression unreadable. Let the villagers watch him pass, not with reverence but with mild interest, and then turn back to their work. Let us remember that history is shaped not only by those on horseback, but by those who watched the horses go by and kept walking in the other direction. We like to picture armor as pristine, gleaming, made fresh for each brave knight before he rode off into legend. But steel, like memory, ages slowly. It bends, it softens, it rusts, and above all else, it lingers. Most suits of armor were not built anew for every man who wore them. They were inherited, repurposed, and reforged. Their dents told stories no poem could capture. Their fittings were changed, not to impress, but to fit the flesh of a new owner. They were passed down like family names, like land, like stubbornness. And if you trace the quiet life of a single cuirass or elbow guard or mailhood, what you'll find isn't a straight line through glory. It's a thread of care, of adjustments made not by blacksmiths in fanfare, but by grooms and squires and brothers by candlelight. Imagine it now. A dim room, the walls bare, the air faint with the smell of oil, wool, and ash. A young man sits at a bench, squinting over a torn arming doublet, trying to match the thread to what his father wore when he was the same age. The breastplate before him isn't new. It's dulled in places where a tabard once rubbed. There are scratches from a tournament long past, some still crisp, others worn smooth by years of polishing. Along the inside rim, if you tilt it toward the firelight just right, you might spot a name scratched with a knife, half rubbed away. It's not the young man's name. It belonged to the knight who wore this piece 20 years ago, who fought at Crécy or Poitiers, or perhaps not in any famous place at all, just in a field outside Bordeaux, or along the edge of a border that shifted like mist. The armor remains. The man does not. These suits weren't purchased off shelves. They were collections of pieces, some new, some inherited, some bartered for in moments of need. A gauntlet lost in battle might be replaced with one from a cousin's estate. A helmet that once bore a feathered crest might be relined with straw. Pieces from different centuries sometimes met on the same man. Styles clashed gently like dialects from neighboring villages. It wasn't about fashion, it was about function and sentiment. A knight might keep his father's old vambrace even if it didn't quite match the newer pauldrons. He might wear it into battle not because it was the best protection, but because he remembered the weight of it from when he was a boy, watching his father ride off beneath a low gray sky. Armor, when well cared for, could last generations. It required maintenance. Yes, frequent, patient, tender maintenance. Not romantic, just necessary. Mail links broke, rivets loosened. Leather ties snapped with the strain of motion. And so in kitchens and stables and armory corners, armor was mended. Quietly. Not by master craftsmen in forges, but by the people who lived with it daily. The squire who sat up late resewing the padding beneath a gorget. The steward who dabbed vinegar and salt onto rust spots. The blacksmith who, between horseshoes, flattened a dent with careful hammer strokes. These weren't grand scenes, no trumpets, just hands, tools, time. And of course, armor aged like its wearers. It bore the slow signs of war, of waiting, of being worn without need. Some pieces were passed on long after their usefulness had dimmed. A chain coif that had protected a grandfather now hung on a wall. A breastplate outgrown by its owner was given to a younger brother, or melted down or buried with a knight who'd earned a little peace. But more often than not, the armor kept going. Reshaped, repurposed, quietly enduring. A new strap here, a longer sleeve there. Metal is stubborn, and so were the people who wore it. There's a strange comfort in this. The idea that armor, so often depicted as heroic and impersonal, was in fact deeply personal, not disposable but treasured, not flawless but familiar. Every scuff and buckle told a story, though no one wrote it down. And perhaps that's better. Perhaps the real memory of those who wore it lives not in parchment, but in the feel of a glove slightly too tight, or a greave that pinches the ankle in the same place it always did. Perhaps it lives in the whispered instruction passed from father to son. This piece here sits heavy on the shoulder, but you'll get used to it. Or, tie this knot twice, it slips if it rains. So tonight, as your thoughts drift like dust in torchlight, picture the armor not on display, but in use. Picture it hung on a wooden peg in a cold hall, beside boots worn thin at the soles. Picture the smell, not of metal but of cloth, of oil, of old leather stretched and restitched. Picture hands lifting it not with ceremony but with familiarity. There is no glory in this moment, just routine, just memory, just care. The armor waits not for war but for the next person who needs it. Not all endings are loud, not all revolutions arrive with fire and certainty. Some changes come slowly, like a fog rolling in, quiet and almost unnoticed, until one day the world has rearranged itself. So it was with the age of armor. We often tell ourselves the story of its end as if it were swift and decisive, as if the first crack of gunpowder sounded and the knights vanished in a puff of smoke, as if steel was traded for silk overnight. But the truth, as it so often is in history, was quieter than that. Less like a sword dropped, and more like one slowly laid down. Gunpowder did come, yes, but even the first firearms were unreliable, slow to load, heavy, inaccurate. A good crossbow could still match them in speed and precision. The knight in armor did not step aside right away. He adjusted. He endured. Breastplates grew thicker, helmets rounded out like kettle drums. Gorgets hugged closer to the neck. The armor didn't disappear, it changed its shape, becoming more purposeful, more concentrated. Protection migrated toward the chest, the face, the places most vulnerable to the sudden, unromantic violence of a musket ball. Some knights took to wearing brigandines, jackets of overlapping steel plates sewn into cloth or leather, more flexible, more practical, easier to move in. Others donned what we now call proofed armor, breastplates that had been deliberately shot at to show they could withstand the impact. If you look closely at some of these old pieces, tucked behind museum glass, you can still see the dent, small and round, just off-center. A mark not of failure but of survival. A quiet testament that the armor had held. But even so, as the decades wore on, the rhythm of warfare began to change. Cavalry charges gave way to formations. Pikes and powder worked together to push knights back, not with disrespect, but with necessity. It became harder to justify the full weight, the full expense, the full time it took to suit up a man in plate. Armor didn't disappear. It was left behind, one piece at a time. A pauldron here, a gauntlet there. Soldiers kept what mattered most. Breastplates, morions, those wide-brimmed helmets worn by pikemen under gray skies. Sometimes just a padded jack and a prayer. Even then, the image of the knight clung on, ghost-like. In ceremonies and parades, armor found new life. It shimmered not on the battlefield, but in halls, in coronations, in paintings. It was polished until it gleamed, no longer to ward off blades, but to reflect legacy. Plate armor turned from war gear to pageantry. It became a language, an echo of old valor. Monarchs still wore it when mounted on statues. Heralds described it in coats of arms. The knight, no longer practical, became poetic, a symbol, a figure you remembered, even if he was no longer riding past your fields at dusk. And even in decline, the armor itself persisted, carefully stored, lovingly maintained, passed down through generations who might never wear it in battle, but kept it anyway, dusting it off for weddings, for funerals, for memory's sake. Some bits were turned into reliquaries or repurposed into saddlery. Some were melted, reshaped, hammered into tools or hinges or buckles, but many were simply kept. Because history, once worn, does not shed so easily. If you walk now through the quieter rooms of older castles, where the light slants through narrow windows and the walls are hung not with tapestries but with time, you might still find a breastplate mounted high above a hearth, or a pair of gauntlets resting on a wooden chest. No one wears them anymore, but they remain, like the silence after a long story, like the memory of a song after it ends. So tonight, let your thoughts drift not to the sudden crash of endings, but to the slow fade. Let armor fall away piece by piece, not into battle, but into sleep. Let the weight of it settle into the earth, not from defeat, but from rest. Imagine a last knight seated on a low stool, unbuckling his greaves one final time. No crowd, no farewell, just the sound of leather straps sliding through their loops, the clink of steel on stone, the sigh of a man who's come home from something that no longer asks for him. Somewhere between the battlefield and the bookshelf, the knight became someone else entirely. Not a soldier, not a landowner, not a man with aching joints or cracked nails from buckling his own spurs. No, he became a figure of romance, an emblem. His armor grew brighter, his horse more obedient, his quests more noble, and his words more refined. The clatter of hooves was smoothed into music. The dents in his breastplate vanished. He stopped collecting taxes. He stopped shouting orders in the rain. Instead, he rode silently across pages and screens, always upright, always just, always clean. This transformation didn't happen all at once. It crept in slowly, like ivy curling up an old stone wall. It began in the later centuries, when the real age of knights was already dimming, when gunpowder had changed the field and plate armor had found its way into closets and trunks. The poets and storytellers stepped in. They turned muddy feudal quarrels into shining stories of valor. And by the time the Victorians arrived with their hunger for nostalgia and noble ideals, the knight had become a vessel for their dreams. A gentleman with a sword, a lover with armor, a symbol of a past that had never quite existed the way they imagined. Painters followed, giving us visions of gallant figures kneeling before queens, their helmets tucked under one arm, their expressions somewhere between reverence and restraint. Pre-Raphaelite canvases softened the lines of war, replacing them with flowing cloaks and glowing dawns. They showed not the knight after battle, bloodied and broken, but before it, perfect, poised, untouched. The medieval world, once smoky and cold and uncomfortable, was now a landscape of sun-dappled groves and noble suffering. It was artful, it was slow, it was false, but gently so. And then came cinema, and the myth grew legs. The knight, once confined to poetry and painting, began to move. In early silent films, he galloped stiffly across black and white hills. By mid-century, he was the hero of epics, his armor clinking melodically as he rescued princesses and gave stirring speeches. There was no mud, no fleas in the gambeson, no unpolished mail, just polished nobility, rehearsed courage. Even the battles were choreographed like dances, each swing deliberate, each fall graceful. These knights were not peasants, tax collectors, or castle guards. They were chosen, destined, designed, and the classrooms took notice. Children were taught of chivalry not as it was, a loose set of ideals often ignored, but as a code etched in marble. Honor, loyalty, courage, as if every knight had followed it, as if every lance shattered in defense of love, not land. Textbooks simplified the complex like they so often must, and in doing so they helped lift the knight into legend, away from history's tangled truths. But beneath all that, beneath the posters, the novels, the movie scores, something real still lingers. Something quieter than myth, and in some ways, more moving. The image of the knight still touches something in us, not because of what he was, but because of what we need him to be. A figure who tries, who rides toward difficulty, not away from it. Who carries weight, literal or otherwise, and does not drop it even when it presses into the bone. Perhaps we keep the knight close, not because we believe in the story, but because we like the shape of it. The idea that someone, somewhere, might act with purpose. Might endure, even if the world doesn't reward it. And that's the paradox. The myth of the knight is false, but it was built from something true. Not the battles, not the glory, but the quiet moments between, the adjusting of straps, the watching of the weather, the patience it takes to wear steel in the sun. The knight we read about is fiction, but the man who stood in a dim stable, oiling his sword and wondering if the barley crop would fail again, that man was real, just quieter, less polished, more tired, but real. So as you drift now, let the false knight fade softly. Let the movie version take a step back. Let the real ones, the ones with patched mail, reused armor, and calloused hands, step quietly into view. They won't speak in poetry, but they're still here, beneath the stories, waiting to be seen for what they were. Not heroes, not legends, just men, in metal, doing what was asked. And so we come slowly to the end, not with battle cries or banners waving in the dusk, but with the hush that follows, a quiet field, turned up by hooves that have already passed, the mud beginning to settle again, just as the stories do. The knight, who arrived in our dreams so loudly, who clanked into our childhood books with shining armor and noble purpose, now rides away more softly. We followed his trail, not the glittering one left by fairy tales, but the real one, faint and muddy and worn by time. And what we found is not a figure of flawless bravery, but of quiet endurance, of imperfection, patched and polished over again. Not a superhero, just a man in metal, just a human shape, walking carefully through a world that was always heavier than it seemed. All the myths we gently untangled about the armor, the castles, the chivalry, the swords, the smells, the peasants, the pageantry, they weren't told to deceive exactly. They were told to make sense of something sprawling and difficult. History doesn't fit neatly into stories, so we trim it, we soften the sharp bits and polish the dull ones. We prefer the gleam of a helmet catching the light to the long, itchy hours spent beneath it. We prefer a noble charge to a shoving match in a foggy field. We imagine knights riding out on quests because it feels better than picturing them managing grain storage or arguing over land rights. But if you listen closely, beneath the gloss and legend, there was always something quieter there, something more human. The knight, in truth, was not always brave, not always just, not always clean or fair or even very good at his job. He was often political, sometimes cruel, often afraid, sometimes tired. And still, he went on. Still, he wore the weight of it, steel and duty and reputation and obligation, and walked into the world because someone told him it was time to do so. There's something comforting about that, about how even the most romantic figures in our history were not so different from us. They had sore feet, they worried about what people thought, they had debts and dull days and winter colds, they laughed at bad jokes in the barracks, they got bored, they made mistakes, they weren't symbols yet. They were just people trying to survive in a world that asked more than it often gave. The armor didn't make them invincible. It just made them warmer, heavier, slower, more visible, yes, but not necessarily more heroic. We spend so much time telling stories of strength, but the knight's story, when slowed down and told without the rush of music or the glint of polished steel, is one of endurance. of waiting, of preparing, of carrying on, of knowing that the lance might break, or the Lord might lie, or the weather might turn, and still pulling on the mail piece by creaking piece. We imagined them galloping into glory. But more often, they trudged through mud, argued with their squires, checked their boots for holes, and hoped the cook had saved something warm. And when they were done, when the battle ended, or the field fell silent, or their lord was gone, they took it all off. The weight, the metal, the posture. They sat, maybe on a low bench or a stone by the fire, and exhaled like anyone might after a long day. No one wrote that part down. But that's the image that lingers now. A man unstrapping a greave, rolling his shoulder, rubbing the back of his neck, watching the fire, thinking not of glory but of sleep. Because even nights slept. Even nights dreamed. And the dreams you imagine were never about banners or ballads, just a warm hearth, a dry cloak, a field with no thunder in it. And so, dear listener, as your thoughts drift into the quiet, let the night ride off. Not into myth, not into legend, but into something smaller. A muddy path, a field edge, a low fog. Let him vanish not in triumph, but in the turning of a corner, the closing of a stable door, the fading of hoofbeats on damp earth. Once upon a time, or rather many times in many classrooms, history books, and bedtime stories, we were told about knights, gleaming, gallant, clanking down stone corridors, galloping into battle beneath fluttering banners, drawing swords for honor and love. We were told they wore impossibly heavy armor, that they lived in towering castles, that they followed codes of chivalry and noble love, that peasants adored them, that they were heroes. But most of that was never quite true. This series, slow and careful, doesn't tear those stories down with noise or mockery. Instead, it gently folds them away, layer by layer, revealing the quieter truths underneath. Like a knight removing his gear at the end of the day, not with drama but with sighs and sore shoulders, we take the myths apart softly. Each part of the series invites you not to be shocked, but to rest, to listen, to find comfort in complexity, and perhaps to let go of the idea that knights were larger than life, and see instead that they were very much human. We begin with the armor, because that's where most of us start. In our minds, knights are all iron and noise, metal walking on metal, helmets gleaming like mirrors. But real knights were not so encased, nor so uncomfortable. Yes, armor was worn, but not constantly, and not in the towering, impossibly heavy fashion schoolbooks sometimes imply. Most knights wore mail, a flexible net of metal rings over a thick padded jacket called a gambeson. Only wealthier knights could afford plate armor, and even then, it was tailored, well-balanced, and far more wearable than you'd think. They could walk, run, even climb stairs in it. Armor wasn't an everyday outfit. It took time to put on. It required squires and straps and patience. And at the end of the day, it came off with soft grunts and slow fingers. No one wore it to dinner. No one clanked around the courtyard all day in full plate for no reason. It was protection, not pageantry. And like all things protective, it was worn when needed, then laid down gratefully when it wasn't. Then there's the sword, long, noble, gleaming, the very image of knighthood. But in truth, the sword was rarely a knight's only weapon. It was expensive, a mark of status more than utility. Spears, axes, these were the tools of crowded, chaotic combat. A sword was more personal, more intimate. It needed constant care, oiling and sharpening. It was not swung wildly, but used deliberately, cautiously. And when knights fought, it was not like the duels of legend. There was no elegant fencing in open fields. Battle was noise and mud, shouting, pushing, the clang of metal dulled by fatigue. Even tournaments, those staged contests of skill, were more about ritual and spectacle than real warfare. Jousting was highly regulated, stylized, and theatrical. It was a performance of combat, not its reality. In war, the knight was often just one part of a large, unruly mass of bodies moving through dirt and fear. We're told that knights lived in castles, and while some certainly did, most didn't. Castles were expensive, rare, and mostly served lords of high status. Many knights lived in manors, smaller homes, often wooden, built near the lands they oversaw. And even castles, for all their grandeur, were far from comfortable. They were cold, damp, full of drafts, fireplaces smoked, floors were packed with rushes and straw, which collected crumbs and pests. Torches flickered in the wind that slid through stone corridors. Bathrooms, such as they were, meant chamber pots and cold stone privies hanging over streams or pits. Water wasn't heated with ease. Baths were taken less for ritual than necessity. And while the myth of the filthy medieval is itself exaggerated, the real story is one of adapting to the environment. People were practical. They coped, they layered, they endured. But the castle as a place of glittering luxury? That, too, is a myth best laid gently to rest. Another myth, harder to shake, is the idea of the noble knight, the righteous protector, the moral compass of his age. In truth, knights were often professional soldiers, hired for their loyalty and muscle more than their morality. Many were mercenaries. Some were cruel. Others were ambitious, tangled in political games, land disputes, or personal grudges. Nobility as a quality had little to do with how they behaved. And knighthood wasn't always earned on the battlefield. It could be bought. There were fees, networks, favors, dubbings that had more to do with family influence than valor. Becoming a knight was sometimes more about being seen at the right feast, knowing the right lord, or marrying into the right estate. It wasn't a reward for courage, it was often an investment in status. The word chivalry calls to mind a glittering code, a promise to defend the weak, honor women, uphold truth. But in reality, chivalry was a patchwork of loosely followed ideals, often written down by clerics or poets long after the fact. The earliest codes were pragmatic: obey your lord, don't rob churches, fight when told. The lofty version we know, full of love and honor, came from literature, not law. Courtly love, a literary invention, written by troubadours and minstrels, a game played at noble courts, often with more fantasy than fidelity. Most knights were too busy managing estates, leading men, or recovering from wounds to be composing sonnets. The myth of the romantic knight is a dream someone else dreamed on their behalf. And what of the peasants, the supposed simpletons of the fields, gazing up in awe at armored heroes? That story is wrong too. Most peasants were literate in their own way, familiar with land, weather, cycles of growth and rest. They ran the economy. They built the walls, made the bread, raised the animals, paid the taxes. Without them, the knight could not eat or ride or fight. To many peasants, knights were not heroes, but a burden. They were the tax collectors, the enforcers, the men who rode through and took what they were owed. To be a knight was to wield power, yes, but power does not always inspire admiration. Sometimes it breeds resentment. Sometimes it simply becomes part of the landscape, another weight to carry, another fact of life. Armor did not vanish the moment gunpowder appeared. For a long time, it adapted, thickened, changed shape. Soldiers wore brigandines, jackets lined with hidden metal. Breastplates were tested by gunshot, helmets were redesigned. Knights became part of early modern armies, still armored, still riding, even as the world shifted under their feet. Eventually, though, the cost outweighed the value. Armor grew ceremonial, worn for coronations, for parades, for memory. It was polished, posed, admired, but no longer worn in war. And even then, many families kept it, passed it down, stored it in attics and armories. Armor became inheritance, not equipment, a symbol of a time that had passed but not disappeared. And that brings us to the final truth. Most of what we think we know about knights was not written by their contemporaries, but by those who came much later. Victorian novelists, romantic painters, Hollywood filmmakers. They remade the knight in their own image, a shining figure on a white horse, a man of virtue, of love, of clean motives. We believed them, not because the story was true, but because it was beautiful. It gave us something to hope for. And in that way, the knight became something more than real. a symbol of what we wish people could be: steady, just, brave, dignified. But real knights were people. They sweated, they compromised, they made mistakes, they slept in their boots, they followed orders they didn't believe in. They sometimes harmed more than they helped. They weren't always noble. They weren't always good. And yet, they were still human. And there's something gentle in remembering that, in letting the myth soften, in trading perfection for personhood. So here at the edge of the story, we let the night ride off, not into battle, but into dusk, into a quiet path behind a hedgerow, into a stable, into sleep. We remember not his victories, but the sound of buckles unfastened, the weight of armor slowly removed, the way his shoulders sagged when no one was watching. Not every story ends in glory. Sometimes it ends in mud, in fog, in a field just outside Calais. And that perhaps is the truest image of all. Sleep well.